Let's cross live to John Laughland now, journalist and lecturer in political science. Many thanks for joining us on the programme. Always nice to see you. Now, John, what do you make of the spate of Western officials accusing their people of extremism just because they don't agree with the government?
Well, unfortunately, there's nothing new about it. The label extremist has been bandied around now for decades against people who don't agree with the party line, for example, on immigration. So long before the Ukraine war, anti-immigration politicians were, of course, labeled as extremist. But I think the situation is deteriorating, and I think it's deteriorating fast. We saw during the corona epidemic, the COVID epidemic, how basic rights and basic standards of democracy, basic freedoms were dismissed and destroyed at the stroke of a pen, obviously the basic freedoms of association and so on. And we also saw how people who disagreed with the COVID narrative were also denounced as propagandists or spreading disinformation, or even as enemies of the people, as state enemies. That label was used for people who didn't agree with the line on COVID. So it's no surprise to me that this is now being used to people against people who don't agree with the Russian sanctions. It's a way of insulting and almost criminalizing people who disagree, and it's an extremely dangerous development because anthropologically speaking, when a crowd starts to form and starts to direct its hatred and its fear against a minority, well, we all know where that can lead. And unfortunately, there's been a long build-up to this concerning Russia, but also concerning other issues. And now we're seeing the natural continuation of it. People who disagree on things like energy prices and so on very basic and very reasonable issues, are being disqualified and, I say again, criminalized almost by this kind of language. And it's obviously a betrayal of everything which Europe claims to be standing for.
So what does this tell us about the state of free speech in Europe and the way things are headed?
Well, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, and I'm sure not to your viewers on RT, to know that free speech, the permitted margins of free speech are reducing every day, and this has been a problem now for some time. We all know about the censorship on the big social networks. We know about Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it. This has been going on for a long time. The RT obviously itself was closed down at the beginning, for Europe anyway, at the beginning of the Ukraine war. We are traveling down a very, very dangerous path. And what I find so preoccupying about all this is that we are doing in Europe exactly the things which European politicians accuse Russia of doing. So, for example, if you type into Google, as I did just now to prepare this interview, the word in German for enemy of the state, Staatsfeind, I was actually looking for a statement by a German politician who accused the kind of protesters that we saw in Prague of being enemies of the state only a few weeks ago. If you type that into Google, enemies of the state, well, what do you find? Well, funnily enough, you find attacks on Russia. Russia allegedly proclaims its dissidents to be enemies of the state. So we're in this extraordinary position of blindness where we in Europe or our politicians are doing exactly the things that they imagine in their fantasies that the Russian regime does against its own internal opponents.
People across Europe are obviously very concerned when they're being told we have this looming energy and economic crisis, which just seems to be deepening by the day. Just how serious is the situation in Europe?
Well, as far as we know, it's extremely serious. The fact is Europe doesn't have a great deal of choice when it comes to gas and oil supplies. Of course, it can buy gas much more expensively. That's what Rachel Marsden just said. You can buy it for twice or 5 times the price from America or from China or whatever. But the fact is that Europe cannot turn around its energy sources in such a short time. And all the major European governments, as you perfectly well know, I'm sure you've said this on all your reports, are talking about shortages, about power cuts and gas cuts and so on in the coming winter. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. And it's dangerous, of course, also because the uncertainty sends the markets wild. If there's no certainty in the supply, then all the futures markets go completely wild. And that, of course, has an immediate impact on the gas price. So I think the situation is absolutely catastrophic. And above all, what is so lamentable about sanctions is that politically, it's extremely difficult to go back on a decision about sanctions. They've been announced, they've been proclaimed, and politically, it looks like a defeat if you change your mind and decide to do something else. So whereas in a normal war, in a land war, if you have a setback, a tactical setback, you accept your setback and then you try to take another target instead. With sanctions, it's completely different because sanctions are deeply political, and it's much more difficult to lift them, politically speaking, than it is to put them in the first place. And that's the corner into which European politicians have boxed themselves. They've boxed themselves into a corner.
John, many thanks. Always appreciate your thoughts on this. John Laughland, journalist and lecturer in political science.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel for regular updates, or go to forumfordemocracy.com for more content.